Good morning, Miss Hans.
Good morning, my lady. If I may call Miss Caroline Abrahams this morning.
Thank you. Repeat after me. I swear by Almighty God
I swear by Almighty God
the evidence I shall give
that the evidence I shall give
shall be the truth,
shall be the truth,
the whole truth,
the whole truth,
and nothing but the truth.
and nothing but the truth. Thank you.
Welcome back, Mr. Abrahams.
Hello.
Thank you for your continuing help.
Thank you.
Ms Abrahams, good morning. You have, of course, already provided evidence to this inquiry on behalf of Age UK as its charity director in other modules. And I echo my lady, we're very grateful for you attending again today to speak to some of the experiences in the adult social care sector. For those following, your statement for Module 6 can be found at INQ 30509-808. Dealing briefly before we start with the remit of Age UK, you have provided a statement for Age UK England, but there are branches in each nation of the UK known collectively as the Age Network.
Yes.
And they have also provided statements to this module. And I may ask you to speak to some of the issues raised in those statements today.
Yes.
But is it right that generally the issues facing older people in England experienced by Age UK that you may speak to were reflected in the devolved administrations too?
Yes, absolutely. To a degree, there were some slight differences in how the governments responded in each administration, but the issues were identical. And we met weekly online throughout the pandemic and shared experiences and insights.
And before we start, can you provide a brief summary of the roles of the Age Network in the adult social care sector?
Yes. For older people, adult social care is a huge issue because so many use it or feel that they would like to use it. And so Age UK inevitably has a big role in supporting that. The first thing we do nationally and in some of those other countries too is we provide information and advice about how to go about getting social care, because as I'm sure the inquiry's already heard, it's quite a complicated process. So understanding what to do first, who to talk to, we provide a lot of that through our helpline and through written advice on our website. But our local Age UKs, and to a degree in the other nations as well, provide direct support to older people. Some of that, a small amount relatively, comes under the formal definition of social care. So personal care, help with getting in and out of bed, getting meals, those sorts of things, but also a lot of lower level support. So help with cleaning, making the bed, doing shopping, those things that help older people to retain their independence. So they do all of that, and also some local Age UKs provide activities like lunch clubs or day centres that an older person, say, with dementia could go to, spend a day, gives their carer at home a break. So an awful lot of activity in the social care world.
Thank you. And you have set out in your statement in quite a lot of detail the state of the adult social care sector before the pandemic. So in summary, is it right that there has been a year-on-year increase in older people applying for adult social services and care, but a decrease in the number of people receiving it?
Correct.
And just briefly, why is that?
Essentially, the provision of social care in our country is fiercely rationed, and that's because of the amount of money that goes to councils to fund social care. And there's always more people who want social care than are able to get it. So over time, as that trend has continued, the threshold, the amount of need you have to be eligible for social care from the state has gone up. So that's why that has happened.
And you also say in your statement that 1 in 10 older people who are aged over 65 years old were in receipt of formal help or home care prior to the pandemic.
That's right.
And in your view, how did the state of the sector at the start of the pandemic impact its ability to respond?
It made it very fragile and not resilient to cope with the sort of battering that the onset of a pandemic brought. In particular, there wasn't enough staff in many places. Staff, as you will have heard, are on fairly poor terms and conditions. There's a lot of flux, a lot of change, people coming in and out of care homes and home care, often trying to do too much without enough time, and not enough money to actually fund the social care that everybody needs. And very, very fragmented. Not really, in many ways, social care is an essential public service. But because of who offers it, a combination of the private sector and the not-for-profit sector predominantly, it doesn't feel like it, and it's not organised like it. And that meant there was no infrastructure, not the systems and processes in place that would have helped to support social care and all the people working in it and also using it when the pandemic came along.
And you have prefaced your statement by saying that some people reported a positive experience during the pandemic and that some of the innovations and good practice should continue. Can you provide a couple of examples of those innovations and good practice that you say should continue?
There was, for some companies, a greater use of technology to try to communicate with their staff, to help with rotoring. Of course, that's a trend that is continuing with the advent of AI, but I think it accelerated it for some companies that were progressive and also probably weren't as fragile and cottage industry-like as some others. So that was helpful. There's no doubt that many care workers worked incredibly hard, put themselves at risk, were prepared to do things we shouldn't really have asked them to do without sufficient protection for themselves and their families. And I have personal experience of that too. It's not in my statement, but throughout the pandemic, I was also caring for my mum at home who was dying with a package of care. So as well as doing my job for Age UK and seeing these issues from all our information sources, I was experiencing them day by day in real life as well.
And you have also identified in your statement that Age UK witnessed systemic failings during the pandemic, which led to the perception, particularly during the early stages, that older people were an afterthought and sometimes their lives were considered less because they were older. Why do you think that perception developed?
Because of the facts as they became apparent. I think quite early on we could see the pandemic hitting other countries first, particularly Italy, for example, and America, where there were already stories in the media about the care sectors in those countries being impacted by the pandemic in a very adverse way. And we weren't quick enough in our country to pick up on those. And really, the amount of knowledge and information held by government about social care generally and about the needs of older people within it was very limited, as they themselves admitted at the start. And there was a lot of catching up having to be done very quickly. And there weren't the structures in place. There weren't the people in place on committees, for example, at a time of crisis to help the government make informed decisions about older people in the context of social care.
And at the very start of March, on the 10th of March 2020, Age UK issued a statement which said that the government has to step up to advise on how the sector can plan a more coordinated and resilient response. So is that essentially in response to what you were saying there?
Absolutely. And a lot of the focus inevitably and understandably was on the NHS, and that was quite right. But even early on, it felt as though social care had been forgotten.
And you made a further statement on the 10th of April, so a month later. And you've said in your statement that you made that because the sense of unease had turned to real alarm. So would it be fair to imply from that the action that you had asked to be taken a month earlier had not in fact materialised?
Correct.
And at that point in time, so the middle of April, what were Age UK's key concerns?
That we were hearing about many deaths of people in care homes. It seemed that, in particular, that the virus, once it got into a care home, was causing havoc, and yet there was no coordinated response from government. We weren't being able to, we were trying to persuade them to do things, but I think because it was a time of crisis, they sort of circled the wagons, by which I mean they were less open to comments from outside, and it made it very difficult for organisations like mine to be able to give what we would hope to be good advice. But you could see it playing out, and from what we were hearing from older people and their families, and from professionals too.
A few days after that statement, so the 16th of April 2020, a government strategy for the adult social care sector was issued. You've perhaps answered it in that previous answer, but had your organisation been consulted on that before publication?
I don't think we were. I'm trying to remember. Subsequently, later on, as the pandemic continued, we were much more heavily involved. But early on, no, much less so.
I think you've given some examples in your statement of the ways in which communication certainly improved during the second wave, and you provide the examples of the capacity tracker in England. Yes. And that Age UK were also part of the UK government social care sector COVID-19 support task force. Both of those occurred in 2020, later in 2020, sorry. So were those examples of how that two-way relationship improved?
Yes, but it was also to do with people. So when Sir David Pearson was appointed to come into government and support them on social care, that made a huge difference because he knew everybody and we could talk to him. He understood what it was like in local areas. He had been a director of adult social services himself. He had a much better granular understanding of the needs of social care, and he had the relationships with people like us and many others to be able to draw us in and gain our help, which I think was really helpful.
Would it have been useful if somebody like Mr. Pearson had been available sooner or in post sooner?
Absolutely, it would.
And do you think that role that he held and the representative groups that were set up as well with stakeholders would be helpful in a future pandemic?
Yes, probably, depending on what the existing structures are within government. It was unfortunate that the leader of social care in the department stepped down very soon into the pandemic, and there was then a gap, I think, before someone else was appointed. That's not a criticism of that person at all, but if there had been somebody in post who had the knowledge and understanding right from the start, who had stayed, perhaps someone like Sir David wouldn't have been so needed, although he was always going to have made a big difference.
And do you think there's also benefit in those groups meeting and that kind of that joint endeavour taking place in non-pandemic times as well? Definitely,
absolutely. And over time, as the pandemic continued, that there was a group that continued to meet very often, sometimes on more specific issues, such as visiting in care homes, for example, and that also interacted with the Minister of State at the time, Helen Whately.
Yeah.
And all those conversations, I think, were very useful. They helped us at Age UK be able to be clearer with older people and their families about what the policy was, which they very much wanted to know, and which was changing quite quickly. But I think we were also able to bring intelligence from the world back into the department. So it was a win-win.
Finally, this on the early pandemic period, you have said at paragraph 63 of your statement that promises of a protective ring around care homes did not materialise in terms of policy or practice in early stages. What, in your view, was missing?
Partly the fact that the nature of social care as it operates in many care homes, with staff coming in and out, coming from home, not living on site. Some do, but most don't. That meant that there was an immediate risk in the care home, made worse if care workers became unwell and were then unable financially to stop work because of the need to put food on their own tables at home. So the lack of sick pay for care workers was, I'm sure, a big gap that unfortunately contributed to what happened. But there were other problems as well, just a general lack of money really to go round, the lack of access to PPE, to infection control, and sometimes some naive assumptions, I think, by government about how well equipped a care home in particular might be to care for people with medical needs as well as care needs.
We're going to come on to some of those issues, no doubt, in your evidence. But before we do so, the statements that the Age Network have provide many examples of the ways in which they stepped in to provide support to older people. I'd like to ask you about just a couple of those, if I may. A common theme that arose was the use of telephone helplines, some of which received government funding to increase their capacity. Although the service they offered differed slightly between each nation, they all provided a form of practical support and compassion for older people that wasn't just online, but in a different format as well. Was there high demand for those services during the pandemic?
There was huge demand. It absolutely spiked, particularly after any particular government announcements or something said in a press conference that may not have been entirely clear, or when new guidance came out, which it did very frequently. Then we often saw, I think, right across the UK, large numbers of older people and also their families calling for clarification, for reassurance, just in despair sometimes, depending on their own situations.
And did the people that were managing those services have the information available to them in good time in order to be able to provide that advice and support that people were asking for, perhaps quickly after those announcements were made?
Generally speaking, it would be fair to say that they didn't, because very often it was a matter of trying to listen to a press conference or get a new piece of guidance, digest it, and then put it into the sort of language that ordinary people could readily understand. And I think that is another thing to learn from the pandemic, that the officials who in good faith had to keep changing the guidance were not at heart professional communicators, and the civil service skill at writing guidance is not generally done at that pace and for a public audience. It's often for professionals, and I think they could have done a better job with better communications expertise in explaining quite complicated things in a simple way for people. As it was, that turned out to have to be the job of organisations like Age UK.
I think you have referred to that in your statement, that there were various times when you made offers to support with communication, but there was a mixed response as to whether they were taken up or not. So is that something that you think could be improved perhaps in advance of a future pandemic, but then also during as well, if there is the need to communicate difficult information?
Yes, I think so. One police force told us they were using Age UK's guidance and advice rather than the government's, because they found it much easier to communicate to the public. So I think that's just a good example of just the lack of a skill at that particular time in government. Of course, they have many communications people in government, and I'm sure they will do a great job, but they weren't deployed, I don't think, in helping to write guidance, which was viewed as a policy job.
You have also described how Age Cymru partnered with Care Home Cymru and others to develop a platform that offered peer-to-peer support for care home managers. Was there widespread uptake of that support and any feedback as to whether it was useful or not?
I can't comment in detail on what happened in Wales, but I think it would be fair to say that similar sorts of things happened in England too, where people were learning to use technology to talk to each other online in a way that was quite new. It accelerated the use of those techniques. And it did mean that people like care home managers who were very exposed and also very lonely and isolated often in their positions were able to come together and support each other. And I know that Age UK took part in some of those conversations in England as well. True too of people like nurses in care homes, quite a niche group of people, and they were absolutely at the forefront of dealing with lots of these issues through the pandemic.
Do you think that there is a role for more support or perhaps even a service for care home managers in a future pandemic, or that support?
I think there's room for more support for care home managers, full stop, all the time. And the more that can be put in place to help them to support each other, to learn from each other, to identify problems, even when there isn't a pandemic, I think would be very useful.
The inquiry has heard about changes to the Care Act, which meant that duties on local authorities in relation to care assessments and reviews could be suspended, or known as easements.
Yeah.
They were not widely used, which you've acknowledged in your statement. But what you do say is that there was a widespread perception that some local authorities took action along similar lines, but informally. What did you mean by that, and what led to that perception?
We heard anecdotal stories from a few places of areas that were taking decisions to, for example, reduce care packages for people living in their own homes and using the pandemic as a reason for that, but where those councils had not actually gone down the legal route to do that. Not a lot, but some. And we were expecting rather more to take advantage of the new legislative opportunities they were given than actually did. But it felt to us and seemed to us that some had chosen to forego that route and to do something rather similar instead, but unofficially.
You may not be able to answer this, but did you hear in those stories as to why they took those more informal routes?
We didn't. We might surmise as to why they did, but we can't say for sure.
Thank you. And did Age UK have any concerns about the easements if they had in fact been implemented?
Yes, it was something that we and other organisations working in social care looked at with, some concern when the changes were made, and wondered just how big an impact this would have. But of course, this was also at a time when we weren't aware how long this pandemic would go on for and how grave its impact would actually be.
Did you raise those concerns?
Yes, we did, in discussion with officials at the time. I remember us doing that.
In your statement, you have also described the impact on many older people in receipt of care as safeguarding failures, and specifically physical deconditioning and loss of cognition as a risk for many older people. And that one of the reports that you conducted during the pandemic found that 1 in 4 are less able to walk as far as they could by the end of the pandemic compared to before. So what were Age UK's concerns around access to health and to care services in the community for older people, and what do you think were some of the reasons for those concerns arising?
Yeah. So, to a great extent, when people get older, their health often declines, and they will need access to healthcare. And of course, one of the things that happened during the pandemic was that access to routine healthcare became much more difficult, or even impossible, or stopped. So people with health conditions, quite serious ones, went for quite long periods of time often without seeing their consultant, without having their regular checkups. And inevitably, in some cases, that caused those conditions to get worse more quickly than they otherwise would have done. The sheer absence of social care will also have contributed to that. It may have made it more likely that some people stopped taking their medication, for example. That would have been definitely another problem. Or that people became very depressed and anxious. Mental health conditions definitely got worse during the pandemic, made worse by the isolation and the loneliness and the fear of watching the news and realising that for older people, this was a pandemic that was taking many people's lives. So not a good combination of things all coming together. And of course, many people living at home were told to stay put, largely. And people were frightened to go out very often for fear of contracting the virus. And in later life, if you don't move around, you stiffen up, you lose your muscle mass. That's what deconditioning really means. And so it was just a very unfortunate set of combination of issues that together meant that many older people came out of the pandemic, if they survived it, considerably less well, less fit than probably would have been the case without it.
And in your experience, were some of those issues considered adequately or at all, either in the early stages of the pandemic or as it went on in the drafting of guidance and information?
I think it would be fair to say that as the pandemic went on, the unintended consequences of lockdowns on older people became, and on everybody really, became better appreciated, and more consideration was made of those sorts of concerns. But certainly not very much about older people per se, and certainly not nearer the beginning of the pandemic.
And in November of 2020, Age UK produced a consultation response setting out lessons learnt from Wave 1 in regard to access to healthcare and what needed to be improved for older people in Wave 2 by the Department of Health and Social Care. What were some of those key lessons and what were you asking for, and did that improve the situation for future waves?
I think it continued to be patchy afterwards, and that, of course, is characteristic of the pandemic more generally. Some places manage things better than others, but certainly visiting services often had stopped. Professionals had stopped coming to older people's homes. There was more reliance on virtual consultations, for example, in care homes. In some places, those worked really well, but by no means everywhere. There were problems, of course, with access to drugs, medication. There were no medication reviews. So all the normal things that happened weren't there. And of course, the more those could be put in place or put back, or alternatively replaced by online or telephone methods, the better. But I think the way that actually panned out in practice was very variable.
Moving on to consider in-person visits of professionals in care homes. In your experience, to what extent was the provision of in-person healthcare and care homes considered and planned for in advance of the pandemic, or again in those early stages?
There's no evidence that we saw to suggest that was thought about or planned for at all.
And are you able to help us as to whether there are any reasons why older people in particular might benefit from an in-person visit from a healthcare professional that perhaps they're already familiar with, instead of, for example, a remote or telephone consultation?
Well, the first thing to say is that most older people with care needs also have significant health needs. And particularly for frail older people, those approaching the ends of their lives, they may well have conditions like pressure sores, skin integrity problems that do require a district nurse in particular, or maybe a physio or somebody like that to come and help. And that sort of service pretty much dried up for large parts of the pandemic, particularly nearer the start. So in the absence of those things, of course, those conditions which can prove to be very serious for people often got worse.
And what was the impact on the staff working in those care homes?
We heard awful stories about staff who felt overwhelmed by having to essentially try and plug the gap that health professionals not visiting was unintentionally leaving. People who didn't have the skills or the qualifications to have to take a lot of responsibility for very unwell older people, sometimes older people who were dying, not just one, as is not unusual in a care home, but many people all at once. And I think that must have been an absolutely shattering experience for some. And it caused some, we know, to leave the care sector afterwards. Great professionals, but who just really needed to get away.
I would like to ask you, if I may, about a letter that was sent by GP practice to a care home resident in Scotland, in which the recipient was informed that the practice would be ceasing visits. So if we may have on screen, please, INQ 30591 and starting with the second paragraph. Now, the quality isn't particularly good on this version, but I will read out the part that I would like to draw your attention to. So the second paragraph, it states, we need to minimise patient contact to all unless absolutely essential. And then in the fifth paragraph, in regard to patients that get COVID-19, it states we would plan to continue to nurse our patients and not to transfer them to hospital. Sadly, if they are so unwell as to require breathing support from a ventilator, it is unlikely that given their frailty, they would survive. Firstly, is this the type of letter or the approach, one that Age UK heard people experienced during the pandemic in Scotland or elsewhere in the UK?
We heard these kinds of things right across the UK. What is unusual about this is that the practice actually wrote it down and took the trouble to communicate with patients and care homes formally about it. More often, I think these things happen informally, or they were conversations, they weren't actually documented. And to an extent, I think this practice deserves some credit for it being upfront with people about what it was intending to do, even though we wouldn't necessarily agree with it. Certainly, the issue of whether an older person in a care home would be taken to hospital if they became unwell was something we heard quite a lot about right across the UK. And I think I put in our written evidence about talking to a very senior clinician who had had to intervene personally with the hospital to enable an older person with a very routine respiratory problem to be admitted. It was absolutely something the hospital could help with. But had he not intervened, there would have been no possibility of that person attending.
Yes, I think you've described concerns about non-conveyancing practices during the pandemic. So again, were they quite widespread from the evidence that you received?
Very much so, yeah.
And did you try to bring such issues to the attention of national decision makers or even local governments or practices?
Yeah, we very much did try and raise this as a real concern, as a concern about the way older people were being viewed and treated, and the lack of respect for their human rights and their ability to access healthcare alongside everybody else of all ages, regardless of whether you're in a care home or living at home or in hospital. We all have the same right, and that right was not being observed. And we shared those concerns across our Age UK family and with the commissioners in Northern Ireland and Wales, and we published a statement actually saying that, and there was some response to it, but I think from what we heard, there was patchy implementation thereafter on this issue, as indeed on many others throughout the pandemic.
I'd like to ask you now just briefly about end-of-life care and medications. What concerns did Age UK have about the changes to medications and prescriptions generally in care homes and in the community during the pandemic?
Well, especially at the beginning and the early stage of the pandemic, it was a degree of disorganisation, a lack of process and system, which meant that it became very difficult to get hold of end-of-life medications to ease people's suffering, as would routinely happen. And the rules were in place, of course, to protect the public, but they turned out to be very unhelpful during a pandemic when a much more urgency was required, and it took the government time to change those. And sadly, during the months that happened, that led to people dying in care homes, not in a dignified way, not in a pain-free way, and it put the professionals working there, sometimes nurses, very often not medically qualified people at all, in a horrible position when they had a lot of people there who needed those drugs. They weren't able to share them from one person to another either, for fear of breaking the rules. Over time, those rules were changed, but if those things were not in place, perhaps they could have been planned for.
Can you recall, and don't worry if you can't, but when those rules changed or when the situation improved?
I can't recall for sure, but it was during that year, I think, quite quickly, but the damage had already been done for so many people.
The inquiry has heard a substantial body of evidence regarding DNA CPR notices, but if I may ask you this, what were some of the issues that Age UK heard or observed around communication about DNA CPR decisions with the patient, but also with family members too?
I think it's important to say from the outset that communication at all times about this issue is often not very good. That's the broader context. But during the pandemic, it was arguably even worse, with people receiving phone calls out of the blue, telling them that this had been put on their file, which is completely improper and against practice, because the whole point of these decisions is they are personal decisions for all of us to take for ourselves, and they should be decisions we take well in advance of actually needing to implement them, ideally when we're fit and well and younger. Of course, that wasn't the situation in the pandemic. I think there was a widespread fear amongst clinical professionals of services becoming overwhelmed. And the result was sometimes a knee-jerk reaction, a desire to get all the paperwork in place in case the worst happened. But that was again in denial, really, of older people's rights and caused a lot of upset and fear amongst older people and, of course, their families.
I think during your evidence to Module 3, you were asked how trust can be rebuilt between healthcare, government and older people to ensure they have the confidence to ask their healthcare needs are met in a future pandemic. And in response to that, you said that advanced care planning needs to be taken more seriously across society, not just as something to be used in extremis. So how do you think we can achieve that in normal times? And then how do you think that can also, we can ensure that that continues to apply during a pandemic as well?
I think it's a very difficult thing to do from where we are now, rebuilding that trust. And I think I should also say that now that our country has voted to legalise assisted dying, that changes the context as well. And we know at Age UK that some older people right now are reluctant to engage in advanced care planning for fear that it's something to do with assisted dying, which actually it isn't. But I think this whole area has become more complicated for people, and we will need to do a lot as a society to support people in understanding the benefits of advanced care planning, what it is, what it isn't, and enabling them to take part as early as possible.
And how do you think that will help in a future pandemic, if we've had those conversations before?
It would mean that there wasn't a perceived need by professionals to rush people into having these conversations, which perhaps was an understandable reaction given the stress that they felt under, and as they looked early on particularly at how their medical services were getting quite close to being overwhelmed by surging demand as a result of the pandemic.
And just on the topic of visiting of loved ones in care homes, again, an area the inquiry has received a lot of evidence about, but you describe in your statement how it was the most common concern that was heard through your helplines. And so can you provide some examples of the impact on older people and their loved ones that your organisation observed, perhaps in particular those receiving palliative or end-of-life care or suffering from dementia?
Well, those were exactly the groups who were hit the hardest, arguably, if they were living in a care home and were unable to have face-to-face contact with their loved ones. For people with dementia, may have not much understanding of who they are, where they are, but retain a strong, affectionate bond with the people closest to them that provides reassurance. And of course, for people like that, visiting is often not just coming and saying hello, it's also helping with eating and drinking and very important things like that. So the absence of that support for that group was terrible, and I think in some cases led to people deteriorating very quickly, dying faster than would otherwise have been the case, as well, of course, as being very painful for their relatives. And then for people at the end of life, the time at which, for most of us, we would want to have our loved ones close to us, and definitely for loved ones, the time when they would often think it most important to be present, the inability to be there. Something that will probably scar the people who live through that for the rest of their lives, a continuing source of deep regret and sadness, experienced by very many people, unfortunately.
I'm picking up on something you said there around visitors perhaps not just being there in person, but also undertaking tasks whilst they're there. And I think you've said in your statement how the term visiting fails to capture that role of family and carers, not only supporting the care recipient, but also supporting staff as well. So was that understood in the guidance, do you think? And if not, how could it be in future?
I think it wasn't really appreciated. More generally, I think the people writing the guidance often had very little practical experience of what it's like in a care home. They weren't usually former professionals. I'm sure they took advice and insight from people who were, but the officials themselves were civil servants, policy officials, good at doing policy, not necessarily with the understanding of the context. So the more hands-on professional experience advice that the government can benefit from by having either people on its staff in that position or excellent links to groups of professionals outside, the better the policy will ultimately always be.
And in 2021, Age UK were invited to join the care home visiting stakeholder group in England. I think that was around February to March 2021. And Age Scotland were invited to join the Scottish Government subgroup on care home visiting in December 2020. Age Scotland in their statement have described this as very useful and that their input shaped the care home visiting guidance. So does Age UK consider that its input into the group in England also had the same positive impact?
I hope so. I have to say, my recollection of it is it was a hugely frustrating experience, because what happened over the months was that we at Age UK and all charities working externally got lots and lots of evidence of the pain and suffering being caused to people living in care homes by the lack of face-to-face contact with their loved ones. And at the same time, we were constantly told that there was no empirical evidence, there was no randomised controlled trial, which meant that that evidence weighed as heavily as the medical evidence about the transmissibility of the virus. And it felt like banging your head against a brick wall. And I think it put officials and ministers in a really difficult position, because the public health advice for a long time was so anti anything that might be perceived to enhance the transmission of the virus. Of course, I completely understand the importance of that. But what wasn't seemingly weighed alongside it was the damage to older people of not having visitors, and less emphasis was being placed on what we know now to have been a big cause of transmission, which was care workers going home at night to their families where their children had gone to school. So much emphasis was placed on keeping loved ones out in a way that was disproportionate, and I think ultimately, as we look back on now, a big mistake.
Can I just interrupt? Sorry, Ms. Hans. Ms. Abrahams, I totally understand the point you're making about the impact of visiting restrictions on recipients of care and on their loved ones. On the other side of the coin, I have heard from some loved ones that they didn't want anybody visiting the home for fear of the virus being introduced by them, whoever they may be. So they didn't want visits to take place from family members. Could you help me on that point, please?
We heard that too, and there's no doubt that different families took different views, often within a single care home, which would have made life very difficult for care home managers and their staff trying to come to the right decision about what was best. I think on the whole, those people were in the minority, but they undoubtedly were those voices. But I suppose one thing we have to take into account is that as the months went on, there was greater use of PPE, there was more access to PPE, was more understanding about this being predominantly an airborne virus. Some care homes much better able than others to provide pods in gardens and things like that for safe visiting that would still allow some kind of contact. But I think it would be fair to say we were quite slow generally to get on that bandwagon, and it felt like for a long time there could be no discussion of it at all. And therein lies my frustration, I think.
Thank you.
Thank you, my lady. I was going to ask you whether you think that the type of groups that were set up later in the pandemic would have been helpful earlier in the pandemic, and if you had been invited to join them earlier on, it may have been helpful. Would you agree with that?
Definitely.
You may not be able to answer this, but to your knowledge, were there any groups or representation for the age groups in Wales or Northern Ireland?
I can't answer that directly.
That's not a problem, thank you. A final topic before coming to your recommendations. Age UK produced a report in November 2020, Time to Bring Our Care Workers In From the Cold. What were some of the key themes that were identified in that report and recommendations?
I think our view then, and continues to be at Age UK, that the business of providing social care is a highly skilled task undertaken by people who are hugely committed. It's a much more difficult, demanding task than our usual systems for accreditation tend to recognise, and that care work deserves to be professionalised, and people who do it deserve the terms and conditions that go with it. And part of professionalising the social care workforce probably means putting more structures and systems around it, more expectations of training that you are then accredited for having taken, which might help you to earn more money, which is important in attracting more people to do this very important work. And if we're going to do that, we probably need a register or something that writes down in one place who a care worker actually is, so the public can monitor what training has that care worker got? Have they got the skills to help my mum? Are they the right person? It would probably, we think, improve. It would certainly be more transparent. It would help to identify perhaps people who shouldn't be doing care work, and we think would increase public confidence in social care as part of professionalising this career.
And how do you think such a register would help in a future pandemic?
One of the things that was noticed at the start of the pandemic was how little access directly to people providing social care, the government had. As I'm sure you've heard, they didn't even have a list of what all the care settings were, let alone any way of communicating directly to care workers. For example, about the importance of getting the jab at the right time and things like that, or of access to PPE. Had a register been in place, that would have been much easier.
And do you have any views on who should be responsible for collecting or holding that data and information?
I think it would need to be someone or an organisation that was reliable. It could be a bespoke organisation, a new organisation. As the current government starts to think over the next few years about what a national care service might look like, you can imagine some body being set up, a body being set up to do a number of tasks to do with social care, including that one.
Ms Abrams, are there any further recommendations that we haven't already discussed today that you would like to draw our attention to, either on behalf of Age UK or the network more generally, to improve the situation for older people in a future pandemic?
Well, I suppose on reflection, being in a care home turned out to be almost the worst place you could be during the pandemic, simply as a result of unintended consequences and the nature and behaviour of the virus. Part of the problem, I think, was that thought was given to the needs of people in their own homes and people in hospital, and people in care homes and using social care more generally fell down the gap in between. And a lot of what didn't happen, I think, is because of that. So what that tells me is that in future, we do need something much more like a genuine national care service. We need more national infrastructure to support it. We need quality standards. We need transparency. That would have supported a stronger social care system when the pandemic hit. The second point I would particularly draw attention to is the need for much more recognition of the rights of older people, particularly, for example, in care homes where they have no rights really at all. It was a source, I think, of great sadness and surprise to families who had always thought they were partners in their loved one's care with the care home, that once the pandemic struck, it didn't feel like that at all, and that their loved one didn't have any rights really either. So that definitely needs to be addressed. And then thirdly, and finally, you'll be pleased to hear, important that we put some more structures in place to hear the voices of older people and those who represent them in government. As I have said, when the crisis hit, there's an absolute understandable tendency in government to circle the wagons, to look inwards. You're much more inclined not to listen to people outside. There's a lot of tension and anxiety, and there's some confidentiality too. And that didn't help older people during the pandemic because there was no one inside government thinking particularly about older people and not enough people thinking about social care. So addressing that through appointing a commissioner for older people, probably a minister with more responsibility, setting up a cross-cutting unit of officials. These are all the types of things that could easily be done. And they would have made it less likely, I'm sure, that older people would have been forgotten too often during the pandemic.
Thank you, Ms Abrams. My lady, that's all of my questions. I believe there are some further questions.
There are, and I think it's Ms Morris who's first to go, who's just to your right, Ms Abrams.
Thank you. Good morning, Ms Abrams. I ask questions on behalf of the COVID Bereaved Families for Justice UK. And just two topics for you to expand on, please. The first is around structural inequalities and the impact of the pandemic on ethnic minorities. You described in your statement how older people from minoritised ethnic communities have experienced higher mortality from COVID-19 for the majority of the pandemic than white older people. So I wanted to ask you whether you believe the government did enough to recognise that disproportionate impact of the pandemic at an early stage?
I do not think the government did enough to recognise the importance of structural inequalities on the impact of older people's experiences. You have quoted particularly the issues around people from minoritised communities, but more generally, there was, I think, no evidence of people thinking strategically about who are the older people going to be at greatest risk, how do we identify them, what can we do to better protect them. And of course, anyone subject to a structural inequality is going to inevitably have been hit harder. For example, people from minoritised communities tend to be on lower incomes, more likely to have had problems accessing buying PPE if they were at home, being able to afford those things, probably less able to advocate for themselves, having less access to external support during the pandemic, and if in a care home, more likely to be in a care home in a deprived area, a state-funded care home, less well-staffed, more subject to churn. All these things are obvious when you look at them now. I don't think they were thought about before the pandemic.
Thank you. So looking forward, what is needed to ensure that structural health inequalities are addressed in advance of a future pandemic?
I think there just needs to be a more strategic look, really applying a safeguarding lens, for example, to older people. Where is the threat and who is it most likely to hit? And if you apply those two prisms to thinking about your planning, that would have taken you inevitably to thinking much more about people in difficult circumstances of all kinds.
Thank you. My second topic is around discharging patients from hospital into care homes, although you deal with discharging into domiciliary care as well. You said that in the first wave of the pandemic was witness to a particularly devastating outcomes in care homes and places where people were receiving domiciliary or home-based care. You said the policies and guidance at the time, and you're referencing there the discharge of untested patients into care homes, failed to consider the highly relevant risk to care homes, residents or staff from asymptomatic transmission until mid-April 2020. You go on to identify that between 2nd of March and 12th of June 2020, there were more than 19,000 deaths of care home residents attributable to COVID-19. And you say in your statement that in your view, older people's rights were breached through unsafe discharge of infected COVID-19 patients into care home facilities. You say in future, discharge to vulnerable settings should only happen where measures are in place to ensure the safety of the patient leaving hospital and the safety of the people at the discharge address. So I wanted to ask you, do you agree that it was a fundamental failure of government at the outset of the pandemic to allow discharge of patients from hospital into care settings without confirmation by way of a negative test?
I do.
Was Age UK consulted about this policy before its implementation in March 2020?
Not as I recall.
Are you aware of government considering the obvious and inherent risks of that policy?
That wasn't obvious to anyone outside government, I believe, at that time.
Right. In your view, were care homes equipped to deal with those new admissions who had not been tested? For example, did they have sufficient facilities to isolate or quarantine returning residents? Did they have sufficient bed staff or resources, PPE, and was there necessary training in place to make that safe?
I think it would be fair to say that some care homes were better placed to do that than others. If they were new buildings with separate rooms, with lots of space, that would have given them an advantage. But even for them, it would have been very, very difficult without access to enough PPE, without having the trained staff always in place. So for almost every care home, it was a very bad idea.
Thank you, Ms Abrams. Those are my questions. Thank you, my lady.
Thank you, Ms Morris. And I think it's Mr Foley, who's probably across the hearing room.
I am, my lady. Thank you. Good morning, Ms Abrams. I ask questions on behalf of the COVID-19 Brave Families for Justice, Cymru. I'm conscious of your earlier comments about not being able to answer directly in regards to some issues in Wales, but I just have one topic to raise with you regarding measures after the pandemic that if I could see if you can help us with. May I ask, please, to your knowledge, again, since the pandemic, has Age Cymru had any interaction with the Welsh Government, Public Health Wales, or any other government or public health organization, in Wales, of course, to address the lessons learned from the pandemic with regard to older people and care homes?
I'm sorry, I can't answer that on behalf of my colleagues at Age Cymru. I don't want to get it wrong.
Okay, in that case, I'll leave it, and I thank you. Thank you, my lady.
Thank you very much, Mr. Foley. Ms. Abrahams, that completes the questions we have for you. I think you're, in my book, one of the most perfect witnesses you can have. You're not only extremely informative and very, very helpful, but you're also a stenographer's dream. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
For clarity and the content of what you've provided for the inquiry. Much of it was really, really important to us. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
I was going to suggest we break before the next witness, but we're ahead of time. Should we go to the next witness? Sorry, having told the team that...
I will just check, my lady. Yes, we can move straight to the next witness.
Sorry for the confusion. Thank you. Miss John.
Good morning, my lady.
Sorry, it's probably my fault there's a delay in bringing the witness in. I suggested we were going to break after the first witness.
My lady, the next witness is Miss Emily Holzhausen.
Thank you.
I swear by Almighty God
that the evidence I shall give
that the evidence I shall give
shall be the truth,
the whole truth,
and nothing but the truth.
and nothing but the truth.
Thank you.
Good morning, Ms. Holzhausen. I'm sorry if there was a confusion about whether you were going to give evidence after the break or not. My fault entirely.
Not at all. That's absolutely fine. Thank you.
Good morning. Could I ask you to confirm your full name, please?
Yes, my name is Miss Emily Holzhausen.
Thank you. And could I ask you just to keep your voice up a little bit, please? Thank you. Is it right that you have come to give evidence as the Director of Policy and Public Affairs at Carers UK?
I have.
And that is a UK-wide charitable organisation that represents nearly 50,000 unpaid carers across the UK. Carers UK has an affiliate network of local carer organisations which covers many millions of unpaid carers across the UK. Is that right?
That's correct. And we have the 50,000 refers to our individual membership. So we really are here to represent all of the millions of carers in the UK today.
Thank you. And is it right that you have offices in each of the devolved nations?
That's correct. And they work very directly with the administrations and elected parliaments and assemblies in those nations as well.
Thank you. So although the work of Carers UK is UK-wide, in terms of the evidence that you can provide and the assistance that you can provide, is it right that aside from the matters relating to devolved nations in your statement and documents, you otherwise aren't able to assist with specific issues that arose in the devolved nations?
That's correct. We'll be concentrating largely on England, but there are important divergence in some of the nations which we need to learn from.
Thank you. And we will go on to deal with some of those matters in due course. Thank you. Could I start, please, by asking you who are unpaid carers?
So, unpaid carers are people like you and I. They are family, friends, and neighbours. And there's around, it depends which study you look at, but about 5.8 million people who are unpaid carers in the country today. They're not people who are paid to do it as a contract, neither are they volunteers. And the types of support that they provide can range from more intense emotional support, prompting. It might be somebody with mental illness, and they're caring for somebody who has a disability or a long-term condition or needs support because they're older. But it can go right up to caring for somebody 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. It can include some quite complex care, including health tasks as well, that you might expect a trained nurse to do. So we have a very broad spectrum of people who are unpaid carers today.
Thank you. Sorry, did you?
Well, one of the points I wanted to say is that most people don't consider themselves to be called carers or unpaid carers. They are primarily, fathers, mothers, brothers, sisters, partners, sons, nieces, nephews, good neighbours, good friends. And that's a term that people don't always associate with, but it's very important in law and in policy guidance, as I'm sure we'll come to later.
Thank you. And is it right that research carried out in 2022 showed that over the period of 2010 to, I think, 2020, 4.3 million people across the UK became carers every year? I think that equates to about 12,000 people a day becoming carers. And is it right that more than 4 million people also left their caring role? Leave their caring role every year, and does that show how dynamic the group is really, with people moving in and out of caring roles all the time? Is that right?
That is correct. So you can think of it quite simply as 1/3 of the population become carers every year, and 1/3 of the people stop caring. And that's quite important because it affects how we identify carers. It affects the support they need. So some people's caring can be relatively brief, and other people are caring throughout most of their lives. And for children, some children, it can be a very long time indeed, or parents of disabled children.
Thank you very much. Is it right, I think you said earlier in your evidence that there are about 5.8 million unpaid carers in the UK. In your statement, you say that it's estimated to be between that and about 13 million. Why is there so much uncertainty as to how many unpaid carers there are?
It really depends on how you construct the research. So you will see, for example, the census is, we quote those figures quite a lot. That's where we now get slightly updated figure of 5.8 million now that Scotland completed its census 1 year later.
Sorry, just pausing there. The figures that you are discussing, are they, so there's 4.7 million in England, 311,000 in Wales, 222,000 in Northern Ireland, and 627,700 in Scotland, according to the most comprehensive censuses in each of those countries.
That's right. The census in Scotland was a year later, so those figures have shifted slightly and they're higher. But the reason, if I come back to the figures about why over 13 million, and that is down to polling. So we polled the general public with a slightly expanded question, so we were able to explain a little bit more about what we meant by unpaid caring, and that's why we get a different figure. But the polling was very important because we needed to measure exactly what was happening to this very dynamic population in a very unprecedented situation, and it told us a lot.
Thank you. And can I just ask you, the figures that I've just quoted, do they apply to children as well as adults? And if so, are you able to help us as to the proportion of adult carers or not?
That's right. They do also apply to parents of disabled children and children with long-term conditions, but other studies suggest that 92% of people caring are caring for an adult. So where I'm looking at these statistics, we can take a large degree of confidence that the majority of people they will refer to are caring for adults.
But the carers themselves are all adults, are they, in those figures?
Yes.
Thank you very much.
There is a small account of young carers within the figures of about 175,000.
Can we look at terminology, please? This is a matter you discuss in your statement, and you say that unpaid carers are at times referred to as a workforce or a sector. You say that that can be misleading. They are individuals who are not formalised, not paid by the state, and are not protected like paid workers by employment legislation in relation to their unpaid caring responsibilities. You also say that very often families do not have a choice about caring. Is the point that you're making that they are not a group with formalised peer support or protections under employment law, and therefore it's important to distinguish them from the paid workforce who do have certain protections under the law?
It's hugely important. And if you think when people are talking about organising workforces, it's a very different matter when we're talking about relatives and friends who are untrained, who don't necessarily, who quite often become experts in conditions, but certainly don't start out that way, who are thrown into situations when they're caring for people with some very complex conditions when care is withdrawn. So it's very important to see this group as very differently. As you said, they don't have employment rights, they aren't covered by health and safety legislation in the same way, and their benefits, if they are unable to work, for example, their benefits are the lowest of their kind.
And in terms of the protections that would otherwise be available under employment law, do they cover matters such as statutory sick pay, working hours? So those are the things that they don't have access to.
They don't have access to. There's nothing to cover them in that way. So that's why we see people caring for 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, and going without vital breaks as well.
And in terms of support that they do have, is it right that they are eligible to have a carer's assessment, and then depending on the outcome of that, they may receive support through the local authority? And what kinds of practical support would a carer be eligible for?
Well, the carer's assessment looks at a whole range of different areas. For example, people's ability to work if they wish to, their health and well-being. They're supposed to look at breaks. You can provide additional care to the disabled person or person needing care if that then helps achieve the carer to achieve the outcomes they wish to achieve. But the sorts of other support, there's very flexible direct payments or grants, so the carer is effectively able to pay these to buy anything that supports their outcomes. So it's anything from a laptop, it might be taking up a hobby, that kind of thing. They tend to be quite small grants. Sometimes it's referrals to different advice and information or different support groups. There's a whole range of different support, but for carers it tends to be more modest than it is for disabled or older people.
Thank you. And the inquiry's heard evidence, including this morning, about the effect of easements on assessments and the impact of that on people receiving support, including carers. Could I ask you this, please? Is it right that in each of the UK nations there's a slightly different definition of carers under the applicable legislation? In England, is it right that unpaid carers at the beginning of the pandemic and prior to the pandemic were just referred to as carers? But during the course of the pandemic, because there was some confusion arising with the paid workforce also being referred to as carers, you decided to change the name. So you now refer to them as unpaid carers. Why is it important to distinguish, aside from the reasons that you've already given? Is there anything additional that you want to say as to why it's important to be clear with terminology? The rights for carers have been hard won
over the years. And it's a term that, although people don't initially associate with it, people take great value in that as carers. But when in a pandemic situation you were talking about communications, you need to be utterly clear. When it makes those messages very confusing to know, are you talking about paid carers or are you talking about family members, as defined by the law? Unpaid carers felt very strongly that this was the term was being appropriated. So when we heard about Clap for Carers, they were very clear that it was not for them, that it was for health workers, and then a bit later on for care workers. And some of them sort of wanted to do a move to sort of recognise themselves under that heading as well. Now we tend to refer to carers as unpaid carers to be very clear, but I just want to be clear about the legislation still remains the same. Carer is still defined, as I just said, not by contract of employment and not as a volunteer, and we would like to keep that in the future, but we feel the need to define carers as unpaid carers to be absolutely clear that it's not about workers. And some of this sort of confusion around terminology we see in some of the PPE guidance and some other areas where we're not entirely clear exactly who it is that we're talking about.
So just to clarify, when you say that there was confusion during the pandemic about which group of people were being discussed or the guidance applied to, do you say that there was confusion amongst decision makers and people drafting the guidance as well as the public?
Some of the guidance that came to me didn't make that distinction, used it for the paid workforce. And then certainly when the communications was going out nationally, that was also confusing for people locally. And a lot of local services use the term carers as well to mean unpaid care. So you can see that in a pandemic, it's critically important to make sure you have clear communications, and even more so when you're talking about unpaid carers and the general public as well.
Thank you. You said that you're not suggesting that that should be done by legislation. But how do you say that that clarity should be achieved during the next pandemic?
We would say by using a slightly different term for paid workers, whether care workers or social care, paid social care staff. There are other terms that can be used other than carer.
Thank you.
Would you like to break now?
That would be a convenient moment. Thank you, my lady.
Thank you. I shall return at 25 to 12.
Thank you.
Ms. Young.
Thank you. Ms. Holshausen, we discussed before the break the identification and definition of unpaid carers. Can I just briefly ask you about recognition? In your statement, you say that the value of support of unpaid carers is estimated as equivalent to the NHS, and that unpaid carers outnumber health and care workers by 2 to 1 as a minimum and 4 to 1 as a maximum. If I may, I'll just read you an extract from a Department of Health and Social Care document from November 2020, and it described unpaid care as being fundamental to the sustainability of the health and social care system. During the pandemic, unpaid carers have been invaluable to the health and social care sector, preventing people from entering formal care for preventable conditions, absorbing or reducing strain and burden on the NHS, and providing care and support for those they care for in their own homes. Would you agree with that description?
We would agree with that description, except that they felt invisible quite often because of the national messaging. And I'm sure we will come on to the impact and the cost of providing that care to them.
Yes, you say in your statement that it was a common pre-pandemic theme for unpaid carers to feel invisible and undervalued, but is that something that continued through the pandemic?
Yes, and I think that comes down to national messaging, clarity about who we're talking about carers. You know, they felt that their word had been appropriated.
Thank you.
And about the support that they were given as well, very directly.
Thank you. And you also say in your statement that there was a mix of awareness between political and administrative decision makers understanding the role and or importance of unpaid carers. So in terms of impact then, please could you explain what the impact was of decision makers not fully understanding and recognising the role and importance of unpaid carers?
So I just want to, if I just start by explaining how people felt at the beginning of the pandemic, in that if I just read some of the words from a carer, if that's okay. I am terrified to the point of suffering a panic attack that either mum or I will become infected, and I'll either have to battle to keep her isolated, or worse, I might get ill and won't be able to keep her safe because I will have to self-isolate. I've been speaking to some carers over the last week to go back to remember what the times were like, first of all. And the responsibility that families felt towards keeping their loved ones safe was immense. And there was a huge level of fear and anxiety. And that continued throughout the pandemic and took a real toll on people's mental health and well-being. The physical impacts were also visible. So when we looked later at carers, 81% were providing more care. And that was because of the withdrawal of services, because they had refused services out of fear of keeping people safe at home. Some of them had had very poor experiences of care, especially with the lack of PPE in the early days. Services had closed and gone online, particularly day services. And so people were becoming very isolated. We saw, just this year, when we look at the GP patient survey, for example, which measures carers' health and well-being, we've seen an increase in poorer health and a difference between carers and non-carers.
Thank you. If I may, can I just focus the topic a little bit? So you've just told us that there were rising levels of care need during the pandemic. I think you said 80%. Is it right that was broadly similar across the devolved nations as well?
Yes, it was. Yeah.
And is it also the case that the needs of people receiving care increased during the pandemic?
They did, and it was very distressing to see, for example, people talking about learning disabled son who was extremely distressed, agitated, sometimes challenging behaviour because couldn't understand why he couldn't go to his clubs and activities. Some people who were very active, young people, were not able to go out, and that manifested itself at home with people's cognitive decline, with people's physical decline. People stopped being able to do everyday activities like eating themselves. Speech and language declined across lots of different conditions: dementia, learning disability, mental illness as well. And that fell on carers' shoulders.
And I think in the very helpful reports that you've exhibited to your statement, you set out in detail all of the impacts. But is it also right that one of the key themes that arose during the pandemic were concerns about PPE? And could you tell us specifically what the impact was in relation to the access issues to PPE?
So first of all, carers, being ordinary members of the public, couldn't access PPE. And we know that there were key issues, first in the NHS and within social care, and social care being very late to get PPE. And one carer spoke about this very well. For example, he said that the NHS staff coming into the home had full PPE. The care staff just had flimsy aprons, and he was extremely concerned about risk of infection transmission. That's a key reason why people refuse services, because they were worried about transmission. And when we come to look at the guidance which suggested that carers themselves might need PPE, it was impossible to buy on the open market. And when we look at carers on benefits, it was a large proportion of their daily income. So we know when gloves cost £5 for just 12 pairs of gloves, and your income is £66. You know, you're struggling to buy food and pay for the heating. It's impossible to get gloves on top of that. And that's why, you know, we need to see sort of very clearer rules around PPE and targeted.
Thank you. And just for context, you say in your statement that pre-pandemic, unpaid carers didn't normally have access to PPE. And so I think you've explained that during the pandemic they were having to purchase it themselves. To what extent did they gain access to PPE through local authorities during the pandemic?
There were some local authorities in England who devised systems for triaging carers who really needed it. And it also has to be said that not everybody lives with the person that they care for, or even if they do, they might go out of the home and come back. And we've got families sharing care and travelling distances to care for people. So it's not true that they're sort of totally isolated sometimes. And so some local authorities provided PPE, but really it wasn't in England. The systems weren't really set up until 2021, whereas in Scotland they had systems set up at the end of April, and it was very targeted and triaged, and those services were not overwhelmed either. And so this was one of our central calls that continued. It's extremely distressing for carers to be told they should be having PPE when they can't get it.
In Scotland, was the distribution through the local PPE hubs? Do you
Yes.
know? And when you say that they were triaged, do you know if they had different data to the data that was available in England? Is the system that was applied in Scotland something that could have been applied here during the pandemic?
Yes, it could have been applied here. The triage system was really talking to individuals about what they needed and who they were, and working between carers organisations and local authorities. And that system could have been applied here, and indeed sort of that similar system was adopted here, but much later, nearly a year later.
Thank you. And just sticking with the impact of that, I think you said that because people were worried about transmission from care workers without PPE, that they were cancelling their services. Is that right? But is it also correct, you say in your statement that providers themselves were sometimes cancelling services because they didn't have the PPE?
That's right. There's a good example of an older woman who had a temperature, and so care workers were withdrawn because they didn't have adequate PPE, and they were concerned that the temperature was a sign of COVID. It might have been a sign of something else, but they didn't know that, so they protected their workers, and the carer was left without support.
Thank you. And before we move on, just in terms of key impacts of the pandemic on unpaid carers during the pandemic, it's right, isn't it, that because of the impact of the easements and the reduction in the support provided to carers, and also the closure of support services like day services and respite services, there was an increased burden on carers resulting from the fact that they didn't have breaks and were effectively exhausted from caring. Is that right?
Yes, they talk quite a lot about being overwhelmed, a large proportion of people being overwhelmed, burnt out, stressed, exhausted. One was talking about where they would normally get 84 nights of respite, but were getting none. And some of these people as well are caring into their 80s, and still having to provide all that care themselves.
We discussed PPE in terms of the access. Can we just discuss the PPE guidance, please? What involvement did you have in the production of that guidance?
I saw, I think, a later draft of PPE guidance.
And did you have sufficient time to meaningfully input into that guidance?
A lot of the guidance was very, very quick turnaround. I mean, there are examples when you just have a matter of hours to turn something around. And I think part of the challenge of commenting on guidance such as that is feeling, well, you might be giving instructions to carers about how to use PPE, but they can't necessarily all use it, but they can't source it. So this is quite challenging when you have a direction that you think a family should be taking, or government thinks a family should be taking, but the ability for families to actually follow that or do it is completely another matter.
Do you consider that the drafters of that guidance with whom you are communicating had adequate understanding of how that guidance would be implemented in practice and how things operated on the ground?
I don't think so. So it's important. I think it's an important demonstration that carers were included, because there have been a number of instances where carers have been left out of key policies to do with the pandemic, when really they should be included as providing such significant amounts of care. So the fact that they were included is a good thing, but the practical application of it, I think, was just a challenge.
How do you think that could be improved in a future pandemic?
I think, the bottom line is, with a future pandemic, PPE is absolutely critical to maintain infection control and to give families the confidence that they will be safe when workers are coming into their home or giving them care in whatever care setting. And I think that's the fundamental principle. We still need carers to be supported and included. We would need those distribution mechanisms set up far earlier for carers, and to carers to be factored into the delivery of PPE. Not everyone will necessarily need that, but there are some examples where it's absolutely critical.
And do you have any recommendations as to how practically distribution should work in a future pandemic to ensure that unpaid carers were able to access PPE in a timely manner?
I think the models that were set up, where they were looking at who really needed PPE when supply is tighter, is critically important, and those models could work in the same way. The real issue is that there's very poor data on carers, and identification of carers across different services doesn't necessarily match up. So in the future, one of the fundamentals that we need is very good data linkages, so that we know who might need this, and for those triage systems to come through local resilience forums, through local authorities, to be able to work well. I mean, carers were also sometimes advised to get them from their local domiciliary care provider, and they didn't have enough for their staff, let alone the families that they were going into.
Yes, and we'll go on to deal with data next, but before we leave this topic, in one of the documents that you've exhibited, you suggest that the local authorities could hold a stockpile of PPE. Is that something that you would recommend in the case of a future pandemic?
Yes, I think so. Unless somebody comes up with a better solution, we need to have resources that can be distributed quickly.
We know that guidance was issued, I think, on the 13th of March to residential care settings, to supported living and home care settings, but not to unpaid carers. That guidance came the next month, I think on the 8th of April. What impact did the delay in guidance being issued specifically for unpaid carers have on them and the response?
There's a lot of confusion about what should be happening, and that's very hard when you're talking to the general public. The guidance in particular, when not just about PPE, but around some other really critical factors like the ability to still travel to provide essential care. Definition of essential care, that was very important. I would like to come back and talk about that as being a key factor at some point, if that's possible.
Sorry, about?
The definition of essential care.
Essential care, I think that's going to be dealt with later.
Thank you.
Thank you. So we've discussed the fact that the guidance that was specific for unpaid carers came later than for other settings. Do you consider that unpaid carers were not prioritised in decision making and in the production of guidance?
Yes. So there was very, very good knowledge at a sort of a policy level, and very good working across NHS England policy leads on carers and Department of Health and Social Care policy leads, Department of Work and Pensions. But there were delays in getting that guidance out. So things were drafted fairly quickly, but it took a little while for it to be signed off. And so, you know, that then impacts on our ability to support people through their journey of caring in the pandemic.
You say in your statement that you were party to some of the working groups that the government set up, and that included the Adult Social Care Task Force. But you also say that, understandably, these groups were primarily focused on care homes and hospital discharges in particular. Do you feel that you had an equal voice in those sorts of forums to help decision makers understand what the real practical challenges were for unpaid carers?
I mean, the social care sector was under such pressure that understandably took quite a lot of the time and the energy and the effort. And so I feel that sometimes comments made were not really then followed up. And perhaps PPE is a good example. Testing, for example, when people coming out of hospital back into someone's home. People needed to know whether there's somebody coming back into their home had COVID or not, to know, you know, they had also sometimes other more vulnerable people in the home. So I don't always feel that those issues were taken forward. I do want to say, though, that the Adult Social Care Task Force that was chaired by David Pearson, he did make sure that carers were a priority, and we did have an equal voice, and asked me to set up a specific subgroup on unpaid carers, and that was given proper and due consideration, and it was very positive.
Thank you. That's the Carers Advisory Group that you co-chaired. And you made a number of recommendations in that report. To what extent were those recommendations implemented?
So some of them took quite a long time to implement. And our recommendation here would be, now we know what we know about the pandemic, do that far earlier. Some were implemented quite quickly. If I look at the ones that weren't, our recommendation was that carers should be in a priority group for the vaccination, for example, and they were left out on the list on the 2nd of December, and it took a lot of work to get them included and recognised by the 31st of December. And the reason the reason why that's so important is, the first is because of risk of infection, and the second is because if the carer is unable to care, that puts far more pressure on health and social care services. And the fact that we recognise this for flu, but it wasn't with the vaccinations, and that sort of lack of recognition came each time. We also made a recommendation about care bubbles, for example, which came a lot later, and there were some which didn't really get implemented in terms of day services returning in the way that they did, breaks, and systematic identification of carers by GPs.
Thank you. That brings us on to the topic of identification and data infrastructure. Could I will turn to those recommendations, but could I start by asking you, please, pre-pandemic, what systems were in place to collect data on unpaid carers at a local level?
So the data sources are all really disparate. at a local level, we have GP identification of carers where they have specific codes. And at the time, I think there are over 100 different codes used. They've been condensed now into 3 or 4.
What do you mean by codes?
They're on the GP patient system. So GPs could identify carers, and it's usually used for flu vaccination and some public health measures, but that's not systematic. And then local authorities, of course, keep records of carers where care assessments, joint assessments, or carers assessments have been undertaken, and sometimes they have other records. We have local carers organisations that keep records, whoever provides the local carers service. Within council tax, for example, you can get council tax discount if you're a carer. That's another record. And then nationally, of course, we have the Department for Work and Pensions and claimants of carers allowance, which is the main carers benefit. But locally, they can't access that personalised data. So we've got a range of different data sources, but none of them are linked.
Thank you. You've answered the question I was going to ask next. Nationally, it's just that there was nothing else. And what gaps do you say there were in data then at the start of the pandemic that would have been useful in informing the pandemic initial strategy and response?
So I think one of the what we saw when we started to look at pulling data lists together for vaccination, that is where we started to see some fantastic practice. And we should have seen that at the beginning of the pandemic. So some brilliant work done by the Health Foundation as part of their Network Data Lab looked at overlap between the lists of local authorities and GP practices in local areas, and they saw the overlap of being actually quite small. The GP lists tended to be slightly more likely to identify people of working age, and that might be linked to flu vaccination, but still a significant number of older carers. Had these data sets been linked earlier, it would have been far easier to have identified a cohort of people who you could get public health messages out to, you could triage for support, but recognising as well who isn't on those lists. So people from ethnic minorities much less likely to identify themselves as unpaid carers. Gypsy, Traveller and Roma communities, for example, have issues about trying to access health services. So there are some equality considerations, but that kind of linked data could be used earlier. The other point I wanted to make as well was the role of the DWP, who was, as a national data holder of all of these carers getting carers allowance and some linked benefits. They moved very positively, very fast to pull those data sets in so that we had the best data set we possibly could for vaccination. That procedure, data protection was an issue. Some, people between sharing of lists sometimes with local carers organisations. So that needs to happen earlier. And those data linkages need to be made.
The study that you alluded to, the Health Foundation study, was that one that's been conducted recently, I think in 2024?
That's right, yes.
And that looked at what data was available in the GP records as against what data was available in the local authority records. And is it right that neither set were seen to be comprehensive?
Yes, neither set is comprehensive, and what was surprising was the lack of overlap actually between them. Some areas did better than others, so this is, when we're looking at building the future, this is something that needs attention.
Thank you. And could I just go to one document, please? It's at tab 4 in your bundle, but it's INQ 000239455. Page 2, please. And this is your statement made jointly with the Carers Trust on the 11th of March 2020. And if we look at the third bullet point, we see there you're recommending that data and intelligence pooling could be a real asset to ensure that we get the best picture possible of those most in need. Carer identification needs to be a core part of this. information systems like 111 should start collecting data on whether someone is a carer and ask this question to anyone who either reports symptoms or has to self-isolate, i.e. they provide an important level of care to someone who might be vulnerable in the community. This should then lead an appropriate response from the authorities. So were you suggesting there that as well as the data being collected by GPs and local authorities, that the government should ask services like the 111 to also start collecting data? And do you know whether that was done?
It wasn't. And it's the kind of thing where with those critical services, having a data flag means that first of all, you can target appropriate responses. And secondly, you can pull the data later for learning. And that's what we need to do with systems, is constantly learn.
And had this been done and had all the data sources been linked together, what impact do you think that would have had on the pandemic response? Do you think that would have allowed for more targeted policies?
Definitely. We would have seen far more targeted, but first of all, carers would have felt recognised, and especially with communication, you could push communication messages out. You could have treated PPE differently with getting food parcels to people who were isolated and had challenges. That would have been easy. You would have seen in evidence that was very difficult to identify who people were in need of support. So it would have, and the health response as well, we could see that in later research, we found that carers were less likely to get through to places like 111, and they were more likely to have their own health treatment cancelled. So this builds up a data picture of risk as well. So, and it's, seeing that we called for that in March 2020.
Thank you. I think you also recommend that a list be drawn up of who in the local community is particularly vulnerable and at risk. Is that something that you saw implemented?
When it comes to carers, that didn't really happen until later. So some local authorities were trying to interrogate their data around disabled and older people with conditions, but that happened in different places. But carers weren't always part of those lists.
The inquiries heard that when early decisions were being made about PPE, it was a consideration that unpaid carers were vast numbers. If that list had been drawn up earlier on, would that have allowed policies to have, for example, targeted initially the most vulnerable people, so a smaller sector of unpaid carers early on?
Yes.
Are there any other recommendations you would make in terms of improving data infrastructure or data collection for the next pandemic? And who do you say, if so, should have oversight of that?
So the first thing on data collection is that we still don't have systematic identification of carers on their patient record. And this is, we have misinterpretation from GP practices, sometimes blocking access, and it's critically important carers are able to do that. There's the potential for the NHS app in the future for, if you had a function built in, you could get carers to identify themselves, but not everybody is digitally connected. That is a very important source. Local authorities' sources, it's a basic question. When you're collecting demographic statistics, you can ask somebody whether they are an unpaid carer. And if we are able to look at that, we're far more likely to get a comprehensive picture of who is an unpaid carer. Where we see equalities issues come up, you're then able to respond to them appropriately, but we don't have the structures still in place, and I feel that has been a real missed opportunity as a result of the pandemic, when we used those data so well that has now been lost.
Thank you. And finally, can I ask you about funding during the pandemic, please? Is it right that in some of the devolved nations there was a one-off emergency fund issued for unpaid carers? such a fund wasn't issued in England, but is that something that you would recommend for any future pandemic?
Yes, so just to explain, in Scotland they have an additional payment called the Carer Support Payment, and they very quickly doubled it. And because of the slightly different legislation in Scotland, which basically denotes that if they spend from their own coffers, it doesn't affect their means-tested benefits. So they reacted very quickly, and that made carers in Scotland thousands of pounds better off. Wales did £500 for carers, but because of means-tested benefits, it was a problem, so it was only people who didn't get that. Northern Ireland wanted to do it, but it wasn't within their powers. So England was the only place that didn't give or want to give carers an additional payment. Now, people who are on universal credit, they got an uplift, but carers who are on the old system of benefits, or outside of that system rather, who got carers allowance, didn't. And it's something where we saw people were talking about being under additional financial pressure, unable, costs had gone up, heating costs had gone up because people are at home for longer, and we did not address carers' poverty in those groups, and that is something we would absolutely recommend. We would like to see a fundamental review of carers' benefits, of course.
But in terms
that's
of,
outside of scope.
Yes.
But in a pandemic, we need to be able to ensure that carers do not face additional poverty because of the extra costs of caring and shouldering these responsibilities.
Thank you very much. My lady, I'm conscious that I haven't turned back to essential care, but it's in fact one of the topics that one of the core participants is going to be asking questions on.
All right.
So those are all my questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Ms. Chung. Right, I think it's Ms. Jones, who should be across the hearing room and slightly behind Ms. Chung.
Thank you, my lady. Ms. Holshausen, I'm sorry, I should tell you who I ask questions on behalf of. I represent John's campaign, Care Rights UK and the Patients Association. At paragraph 13 of your witness statement, you explain that unpaid carers often know the person they care for better than health and care professionals, and that over time they become real condition experts. Do you agree that their expertise should have been better recognised and that they should have been integrated into care teams to ensure that high quality and person-centred care could continue to be provided?
Quite briefly, yes. And that's what they want to be. They not only know the person and their characteristics, but they very often know their different needs. It's absolutely vital on two ways: knowing the person incredibly well, and the second reason is because they are the people who have most contact with that person, or are able to have an insight. If we're talking about care homes, for example, have a different insight into their lives and well-being. If we're talking at home, they're the main deliverers of care. And it's absolutely essential that they're part of the integrated team. When they are not consulted and not involved, decisions are made that are not necessarily optimal and actually can be negative for the unpaid carer themselves. They are deeply frustrated by that. And I think at the point of hospital discharge, for example, we quite often see where carers are not included. And I think that is a factor of the pandemic as well, with the guidance that was issued didn't include carers' rights and entitlements. And that had a long legacy after the pandemic, where we saw that carers weren't included in official guidance at the point of hospital discharge, even though it's in primary legislation. So it's absolutely essential. And I just wanted to come back to the whole definition of essential care, because this was something which people were allowed to do early on in the pandemic, and to be able to travel to provide essential care. And because it wasn't really defined, families and carers were unsure about whether they were allowed to do this. And sometimes the interpretation of the police, of neighbours and others was not the same as carers. So that is something that we really need to ensure with the next pandemic, that those exceptions to travel rules to provide essential care, or perhaps for families to come together, several people, and when that might not look like it's within the rules, to be really clearly defined.
Thank you. Yes, you do cover in your witness statement that although the lockdown rules did permit essential
They
care
did,
to continue to be provided, unpaid carers themselves didn't understand that, but also other people like neighbours and the police didn't understand it, which led to instances of unpaid carers being wrongly reported to the police and even fined for continuing to provide care. But of course, it also caused some carers to adopt a self-denying approach where they didn't provide the care that was necessary, even though in fact that would have been lawful to do, and the person for whom they cared really needed that help to continue to be provided. So you've spoken about the negative impact that the lack of clarity obviously had on people there, but how, in your view, could public communications have been undertaken better so that people understood more clearly precisely what was permitted within the confines of the law?
I think a clear permissive definitions and examples that was communicated. I think in public communications as well, I've said about how families felt invisible, to recognise what they had done as well or were doing to protect people and keep people safe within the community and providing all of that care. That if those definitions had been provided, then organisations like ours would have been able to, because advise people correctly and give them confidence that you could travel tens of miles to care for your mum with cancer and share that care with your sister, you on, you off, and then her provide that. I think one of the things that is very clear is that there's perhaps little understanding of how much people travel to see relatives to provide care, how much families take turns to provide care, how daughters come in to support mum, who is principally the carer caring for dad. All of that could have been done much earlier, like these care bubbles that we were talking about, could have been put in place much earlier, and a clearer definition would have supported us, and it was impossible to get that, really.
Just arising from that, can I ask, to what do you attribute the failure to provide that? We've heard different pieces of evidence to the inquiry about the fact that guidance was being produced at speed, but also about governmental lack of knowledge about the care sector. Was it the urgency with which responses and guidance were being produced? Was it the fact that decision makers simply didn't understand the shape of the adult social care system and the reliance on unpaid carers and the kind of patterns of care they provided? What do you think meant that wasn't done at the time?
I think all of those things, actually, it's a combination of things. And when we know what we know now, we would not operate in that way again, I would hope, and that we would get clearer direction. Furlough is another example, again, where if you were caring, you were able to be on furlough. Again, getting that definition, it was not clear. We got a definition through our colleagues that we work closely with in the Department for Business and Trade, as it is now, and they got a definition from Her Majesty's Treasury, but you didn't find that expanded upon. You didn't find it in communications, and it was very hard to pin down who was responsible for that. But it's something we definitely need in a more concrete way in the future, should this, we hope that we won't be in another pandemic, but or situation like this. But if we were, it needs to be there in place quickly.
And finally, on that topic, can I ask, what do you think the role that organisations like yours and those I represent can play, and how receptive did you find government to involving you in providing those kinds of definitions that were needed?
So our organisations, we're critical providers of information and advice out to people. So we often translate government guidance, and that's where we need to be assured that the definition or our interpretation is in fact in line with what the government is suggesting, and that people aren't going to be caught out by it or and it's putting things in terms that in sort of everyday language as well. Some of those things didn't work quite as well, I would say, at the beginning, When we look at vaccination guidance, for example, who should be vaccinated, that's when they listened very well to how to think about carers, because, of course, it was defined as the primary carer. But as I've explained, quite often there are numerous people who care for one person. They don't all live together. So it's a common sense approach that I think we as organisations understand our populations and people and take a common sense approach to this. So to come back to your original question, I don't think there was the engagement or the understanding that we needed. We did get to part of that better as we went along. I would say that the voices of some organisations were not listened to in relation to contact in hospitals and care homes for quite a long time. And I think people have expressed their views, members of the public have expressed their views very clearly about the impact that has had on them and their families.
Thank you. And then you explain in your witness statement that the reports that your organisation produced during the pandemic were entitled Caring Behind Closed Doors, because that's what carers feel, that their work and their care is invisible. In your view, is there anything that can be done to improve the visibility of those who provide and need care to ensure that they don't feel invisible in any future pandemic and that their needs are properly taken account of?
So first and foremost, it needs leaders to talk about families and unpaid care. That is critically important. And then we need to see them not at the bottom of the list, but further up in the list. We need to have all of those things that they feel are important, identification, the messages, the information and advice, clarity about that, so that they feel more confident about caring, and to have the mechanisms in place like PPE for care workers coming into the home and health staff coming into the home, as well as families who really need it. So those things, it's not just words, it's actions too. And the caring behind closed doors is a very good description of how they felt is invisible. And we can't have that again in another pandemic.
Thank you very much. Those are all my questions.
Thank you very much, Ms Jones. Those are all the questions that we have for you, Ms Holzhausen. Thank you so much. I think behind closed doors is perhaps almost the best way to complete your evidence, because it sums it up. During the course of this inquiry, I've learned about other sectors who do vital work, and recognition seems to be such an important part. I suppose from recognition flows a number of other things, as you've said. So thank you very much for all your help to the inquiry and for your excellent advocacy on behalf of the sector of unpaid carers. Thank you. Well, thanks to the efficiency of counsel to the inquiry and our witnesses this morning, people are going to get an extra 15 minutes lunch, because the next witness, when I last checked, wasn't here, and counsel will need time to speak to them. So I shall return at 1:25 to 2. Thank you very much, Ms Jones.
Thank you.